Welcome, the anointed ones. Pay close attention to what people whisper after they think you've walked away. That's where the truth usually stops wearing a disguise. There is something strangely fascinating about secret conversations. Human beings have always whispered behind closed doors. History is full of private meetings that changed kingdoms, exposed betrayals, and revealed truths that never would have surfaced in public. Here's the interesting part. Psychologists have long observed that people are often far more honest when the subject of the conversation isn't in the room. The masks come off. The rehearsed speeches disappear. Pride relaxes its grip. What slips out in those moments is often closer to what they truly believe than anything they would ever say to your face. Now here's where this gets even more interesting. Most people imagine that if two people are secretly talking about them, it must be full of insults, jealousy, or another plan to bring them down. That's exactly where almost everyone gets it wrong. Sometimes the most uncomfortable conversation isn't about how to destroy you. It's about trying to explain you. It's about people attempting to make sense of someone who refused to become what everyone expected them to become. And believe me, that's a much harder conversation to have. There comes a moment when facts become too stubborn to ignore. The predictions they made about your life never happened. The labels they placed on you no longer fit. The version of you they confidently described keeps colliding with the reality everyone can now see. Suddenly, they're left holding a story that no longer makes sense, and nobody enjoys admitting they may have been reading the wrong chapter all along. What's funny is that people will spend 3 hours discussing someone they claim they don't think about. Human beings are talented like that. They'll say, "I'm done talking about them," right before ordering another round of the conversation. If gossip burned calories, some people would accidentally become fitness champions. But beneath the humor lies something much deeper. Not every secret conversation is an attack. Some are confessions disguised as discussions. Some are quiet admissions of regret. Others are uncomfortable moments where people begin connecting pieces they deliberately ignored for years. Sometimes they're not debating your character anymore. They're debating their own judgment. They're realizing that the person they misunderstood may have been the one seeing things clearly all along. That is exactly what today's message is about. We're going beneath the surface of ordinary gossip and exposing the hidden psychology behind the conversations people have when pride begins losing its battle with truth. You'll discover why these private discussions often reveal more about the speakers than the person they're speaking about. Why reality eventually forces even the loudest critics into uncomfortable silence, and why some of the greatest victories are never announced publicly. They're quietly acknowledged behind closed doors by the very people who once doubted you. Stay with me until the very end, because each point uncovers another layer of what was really said, and by the time we reach the final revelation, you'll understand why the conversation wasn't what anyone expected, including the two people having it. Number one, they finally admitted you were never the problem. The hardest truth for many people to accept is that blaming one person is much easier than confronting a broken system. That's exactly why your name became convenient. It was easier to point a finger at you than to admit there were deeper issues nobody wanted to fix. As long as you carried the blame, everyone else could avoid taking responsibility. But that kind of arrangement has an expiration date because reality has a way of exposing what denial tries to hide. That secret conversation didn't begin with praise. It began with confusion. One of them quietly noticed that after you were gone, the same arguments kept happening. The same disappointments kept showing up. The same bad decisions continued. They expected everything to improve once you were out of the picture. But nothing really changed. In some ways, things became even worse. That's when someone finally said the words nobody wanted to hear. Maybe they were never the problem. Those few words changed the entire direction of the conversation. Suddenly, old memories started looking different. Moments they once interpreted as you being difficult now looked like you were simply refusing to participate in unhealthy patterns. Times they called you stubborn began to look more like conviction. What they once described as rebellion started looking like honesty. The facts hadn't changed, only their willingness to see them had. This is something that happens more often than people realize. A person who speaks uncomfortable truths is usually treated as the disturbance instead of the messenger. The room blames the smoke alarm for making noise instead of paying attention to the fire. But eventually, when the smoke fills every corner, everyone understands the alarm wasn't creating the danger, it was revealing it. That's why your absence became impossible to ignore. Without you there to absorb everyone's frustration, the real issues had nowhere left to hide. Excuses started falling apart. The cracks became visible. The conversations became awkward because they could no longer use your name as a shortcut for every problem they didn't want to solve. The most surprising part is that this realization rarely comes with applause or a public apology. Pride doesn't surrender that easily. Instead, it appears in quiet conversations, hesitant admissions, and long pauses where people finally acknowledge what they should have seen from the beginning. They may never tell you directly that they were wrong, but the way they begin talking about you tells the whole story. Sometimes your greatest vindication doesn't come from proving yourself right. It comes when reality quietly does the talking for you. By the time people finally admit you were never the problem, you no longer need them to. The truth has already reached the destination before their words ever could. Number 2, one of them, quietly asked, "What if we misjudged them from the beginning?" There is a question that has the power to shake years of certainty, and it isn't asked loudly. It usually comes in a quiet moment when confidence begins to crack. During that secret conversation, one person finally said what everyone else had been avoiding. "What if we got it wrong from the very beginning?" The room didn't become silent because they had an answer. It became silent because they didn't. For years, they had built an opinion of you from scattered pieces instead of the whole picture. They listened to second-hand stories, accepted assumptions as facts, and filled in missing details with their own conclusions. It felt easier to agree with the crowd than to stop and ask whether the crowd had ever been right in the first place. That's how false impressions grow. They aren't always created by lies. Sometimes they're built from incomplete truths, repeated often enough to sound convincing. Then something unexpected happened. One person started connecting details that had never seemed important before. They remembered how you stayed consistent, even when people misunderstood you. They noticed that the accusations made against you rarely came with solid proof. They realized that those who spoke the loudest about your faults often refused to examine their own. Piece by piece, the story they had accepted for years began falling apart. The uncomfortable part wasn't discovering new information about you. The uncomfortable part was discovering something about themselves. They had been too quick to judge, too willing to believe what fit the popular narrative, and too reluctant to question people they trusted. Admitting that kind of mistake takes humility, and humility is expensive because it costs pride. What makes this moment so powerful is that it doesn't erase the past, but it changes the way the past is understood. Events they once viewed through suspicion suddenly looked different. Your distance no longer seemed cold. It looked like self-respect. Your refusal to argue no longer seemed like weakness. It looked like wisdom. Your calmness wasn't indifference, it was restraint. This is why truth has remarkable patience. It doesn't rush to defend itself every time it's challenged. It waits. It allows time to expose contradictions that emotions often hide. While opinions can spread in a single afternoon, genuine understanding sometimes takes years to arrive. Number 3, they couldn't explain why your absence changed everything. People often think they know someone's value while that person is still around. The truth is, familiarity has a strange way of hiding significance. When someone consistently shows up, solves problems, brings stability, or simply carries a quiet strength, others begin to treat those things as ordinary. They assume that if one person leaves, someone else will naturally step in and everything will continue as before. But life doesn't always work that way. That secret conversation began with an observation neither of them expected to make. Ever since you left, something felt different. They couldn't point to one dramatic event. It was the accumulation of small things. Decisions became harder. Misunderstandings happened more often. The atmosphere felt heavier. Problems that used to disappear quickly now lingered much longer. It wasn't that you did everything. It was that you contributed something no one had ever thought to measure. Some people bring more than skills into a room. They bring steadiness. They bring honesty when everyone else is pretending. They ask the difficult questions that prevent costly mistakes. They calm situations before they become conflicts. Those qualities don't usually receive applause because they're easy to overlook when they're happening every day. Their value becomes obvious only after they're gone. As the conversation continued, one person admitted something surprising. They had expected your absence to make life simpler. Instead, it exposed how much invisible weight you had been carrying. Tasks were still getting done, but they lacked the care you naturally gave them. Conversations were still happening, but they lacked the trust your presence created. People were still showing up, but something essential was missing, and nobody could quite replace it. That's the difference between being present and being significant. Presence can be replaced. Significance cannot. A title can be filled. A seat can be occupied. A schedule can be adjusted. But character, wisdom, and quiet influence are not things you hand over to the next person in line. The irony is that people often search for your value after you've stopped trying to prove it. They replay old conversations, rethink old moments, and begin noticing the very qualities they once ignored. Not because you suddenly became extraordinary, but because your absence removed the comfort of taking you for granted. Number 4, they realized your peace couldn't be manufactured. One of the most surprising parts of that secret conversation had nothing to do with your achievements. It had everything to do with your peace. One person admitted that they couldn't understand how you remained steady after everything you had been through. They had watched people criticize you, misunderstand you, and even distance themselves from you, yet somehow you didn't become consumed by bitterness. That puzzled them more than any success you had ever achieved. At first, they assumed your peace was just an image. They thought it was something you put on for other people to see. They believed that behind closed doors, you must be falling apart just like everyone else. But as time passed, that explanation stopped making sense. Your consistency lasted too long. You didn't react the way they expected. You didn't spend your energy trying to get revenge or win every argument. Instead, you kept moving forward, and that became impossible for them to explain. One of them finally said something that changed the conversation. Maybe that kind of peace can't be copied. That statement carried more truth than they realized. Real peace doesn't come from repeating inspiring words or pretending that life is easy. It is built through disappointments that teach patience, losses that deepen wisdom, and painful seasons that force a person to grow from the inside out. It isn't something you can borrow from another person's lifestyle or imitate by following a routine for a few weeks. They began to see why their own efforts never worked. They copied habits without understanding the transformation behind them. They wanted the calm without the character that produces it. They admired the strength, but overlooked the years of struggle that shaped it. They wanted the result without respecting the process. The conversation slowly became less about you and more about them. They started recognizing how often they searched for quick fixes instead of lasting growth. They realized they had spent years chasing appearances while neglecting the deeper work that nobody applauds. Your peace became a mirror, showing them that inner stability cannot be purchased, performed, or borrowed. That was the real discovery. What they admired wasn't something you found overnight. It was something you earned through battles no audience ever witnessed. And that's why they finally understood they could imitate your words, your routines, or even your outward confidence, but they could never reproduce your peace unless they were willing to walk the same road that gave birth to it. Number 5. One person said, "They're becoming harder to predict." That single sentence changed the entire mood of the conversation. It wasn't spoken with admiration or fear at first. It was spoken with confusion. For a long time, they believed they had you figured out. They thought they knew exactly what would upset you, what would make you react, what would pull you back into old arguments, and what would keep you stuck in the same cycle. They had become comfortable with the version of you they had stored in their minds. Then something happened that completely disrupted their expectations. You stopped reacting the way you used to. Things that once would have pulled you into endless explanations no longer received your attention. Situations that once would have stolen your peace no longer controlled your emotions. You became less interested in proving yourself and more interested in protecting your purpose. That shift made you difficult to read, and people become uncomfortable when they can no longer predict someone they thought they understood. One of them admitted, "Every move we expected them to make, they didn't." That wasn't because you were playing games or trying to be mysterious. It was because growth had quietly changed the way you made decisions. Mature people don't react to every opinion. They don't chase every misunderstanding. They learn that not every invitation deserves a response and not every battle deserves their energy. That kind of wisdom is confusing to people who are still expecting the old version of you. The truth is, predictability gives people a sense of control. If they know how you'll respond, they know how to influence the situation. They know which buttons to press and which words will get a reaction. But when healing replaces hurt, those buttons stop working. The script they've relied on for years suddenly becomes useless. That secret conversation wasn't really about your behavior. It was about the loss of their certainty. They could no longer confidently say, "We know exactly what they'll do next." And that unsettled them because people often mistake familiarity for understanding. The greatest transformation isn't when people notice you've changed. It's when the methods that once worked against you no longer work at all. By then, you've outgrown the version of yourself they were still trying to manage. While they're busy studying an old map, you've already taken a completely different road. That's why they couldn't predict you anymore. Not because you became complicated, but because you became wiser. Number 6. They secretly wondered whether your integrity was costing them their own sleep. The conversation took an unexpected turn when your name stopped being the main subject. Instead, it became the mirror. One person quietly admitted that every time they thought about you, they also found themselves thinking about the choices they had made. It wasn't because you had confronted them or pointed out their mistakes. It was because your consistency made their compromises impossible to ignore. There is something unsettling about a person who refuses to bend their values just to fit in. They don't need to preach or criticize anyone. Their actions do enough talking. While others change depending on who is watching, they remain the same. That kind of integrity has a strange effect on people. It doesn't always inspire them. Sometimes it exposes them. One person finally said, "I don't know how they kept saying no when saying yes would have made life so much easier." That question lingered because they knew the pressure you had faced. They remembered the opportunities to take shortcuts, to join the crowd, to stay quiet when speaking up came with a cost. They also remembered that you didn't always choose the easy path. You chose the one that allowed you to look at yourself without regret. At the time, they thought you were making life harder for no reason. Now they were beginning to understand that some things are too valuable to trade away. The conversation slowly became more personal. They started thinking about the moments when they had ignored their own conscience to gain approval, avoid conflict, or protect their comfort. Those decisions had seemed harmless in the moment, but they left behind something difficult to escape. Regret has a way of visiting people when the room is quiet and there is nobody left to impress. That's why your integrity kept returning to their minds. It reminded them of the person they once wanted to be, before convenience became more important than conviction. They realized that while compromise may solve today's problem, it often creates tomorrow's burden. The greatest surprise was that you never demanded recognition for staying true to your principles. You simply lived them, and that made your example even more powerful. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't an attempt to appear better than anyone else. It was a decision you made over and over again, even when nobody applauded it. Number 7, they admitted that every attempt to replace you felt artificial. The conversation became even more revealing when one person finally admitted something they had been trying not to say out loud. They had found people with more experience, louder personalities, impressive qualifications, and even stronger connections. On paper, those replacements looked like an upgrade, but in real life, something never clicked. No matter how capable the new people were, the atmosphere felt different. It felt forced, as though everyone was acting from a script instead of being genuine. That's when someone quietly said, maybe it wasn't about what they did. Maybe it was about who they were. That single thought changed everything. Most people measure value by visible results. They notice accomplishments, titles, and talents because those things are easy to count. But the greatest influence often comes from qualities that can't be measured. Trust cannot be listed on a resume. Wisdom doesn't always announce itself. A calming presence doesn't receive awards. Yet these are often the very things that hold people together when pressure rises. Looking back, they realized you brought something into every room that no one had appreciated while it was there. People spoke more honestly around you. Problems were solved before they became disasters. Tension eased without anyone noticing why. You had a way of making others feel seen, heard, or challenged in the right way. None of those things seemed extraordinary at the time because they happened so naturally. After you were gone, they tried to recreate that feeling. They copied routines, changed strategies, and brought in different personalities, hoping the same chemistry would return. It never did. They discovered a lesson that many people learn too late. Skills can be replaced, but character cannot. A position can be filled overnight, but genuine influence takes years to build. The irony is that they only started naming your strengths after they could no longer benefit from them. Qualities they once overlooked suddenly became the very things they were searching for in everyone else. They weren't looking for another person anymore. They were looking for what you carried, and they couldn't find it. Number 8, they couldn't decide whether you were lucky or exceptionally disciplined. The conversation took another unexpected turn when one person shrugged and said, maybe they're just lucky. It sounded like a simple explanation, but the other person wasn't convinced. They had watched your journey for too long to believe that luck alone could explain where you are now. Good fortune may open a door once, but it doesn't keep opening the same door year after year. At some point, something else has to be responsible. They started looking back over everything they had seen. They remembered the setbacks you faced, the disappointments you carried, and the times when it seemed like nothing was going your way. If luck had truly been the reason for your progress, then those difficult seasons should have ended your story. Instead, every setback became another lesson. Every delay sharpened your patience, and every closed door forced you to find a better path. That's when one of them quietly admitted, "Maybe we called it luck because we never saw the work." That sentence exposed a truth many people never want to face. The world notices the harvest, but rarely pays attention to the planting. It celebrates the finished result while ignoring the countless ordinary days that made it possible. People see confidence, but not the years of self-doubt you fought through. They see consistency, but not the moments you wanted to quit. They see success, but not the sacrifices that nobody applauded. Calling someone lucky can sometimes become an easy escape. It allows people to admire the outcome without examining the habits that produced it. It's far more comfortable to believe someone was fortunate than to admit they kept showing up when everyone else gave up. As the conversation continued, they realized that your greatest advantage wasn't talent or perfect timing. It was your willingness to keep moving when progress was slow. While others waited for ideal conditions, you kept building. While others became discouraged by delays, you kept learning. That steady discipline quietly created opportunities that outsiders later mistook for luck. Number 9. They finally understood why you never fought every battle. The conversation became surprisingly quiet when one person looked back and said, maybe they weren't avoiding conflict. Maybe they simply knew which conflicts weren't worth having. That thought challenged everything they had believed about you. For years, some people assumed your silence in certain situations meant you had nothing to say. Others thought you were afraid of confrontation or didn't know how to defend yourself. But time has a way of exposing the difference between weakness and wisdom. They began remembering moments when people tried to pull you into arguments, spread false stories, or provoke you into reacting. At the time, they expected you to respond with the same energy. They waited for a public fight, a dramatic explanation, or a desperate attempt to clear your name. Instead, you stayed focused on your own path. That decision confused them because it didn't fit the way most people behave. One person finally admitted, they probably realized that some people don't want answers. They just want a reaction. That simple sentence changed the entire conversation. Not every disagreement is searching for the truth. Some are looking for entertainment. Some exist to waste your time. Others are designed to pull you away from what truly matters. You seem to understand something they didn't. Every battle has a cost. Even if you win the argument, you may lose your peace, your time, or your focus. Sometimes the price of proving a point is far greater than the value of the point itself. As they reflected on your journey, they noticed a pattern. While others were busy arguing, you were quietly moving forward. While people were trying to defend their image, you were building your life. While critics spent their energy talking, you spent yours growing. Over time, that difference became impossible to ignore. Your progress answered questions that arguments never could. The greatest surprise was that your silence was never surrender. It was selection. You chose where your energy belonged. You understood that attention is one of life's most valuable resources, and you refused to hand it over to people who had no intention of understanding you. Number 10. They quietly wondered if your greatest strength was what you never told anyone. The conversation shifted into unfamiliar territory when one person asked a question that caught the other completely off guard. What if the strongest thing about them isn't anything we've ever seen? For a moment, neither of them spoke. They had spent years focusing on your visible qualities, your confidence, your determination, your ability to keep moving forward. But suddenly, they began wondering whether those things were only the surface of a much deeper story. They realized there were battles you never announced. There were disappointments you never turned into public performances. There were nights when life may have tested you in ways nobody around you ever knew. Yet somehow, you never made suffering your identity. You didn't demand sympathy to prove you had struggled. You simply carried the weight and kept walking. One of them admitted, "We probably have no idea what they've survived." That thought changed everything. People often assume they know someone's story because they can see the ending. They admire the confidence without knowing how much fear had to be overcome to build it. They respect the calmness without realizing how many storms shaped it. They notice the smile, but never ask what it took to keep smiling when giving up would have been easier. As they looked back, they understood why you never seemed desperate for recognition. The people who fight the hardest private battles often stop chasing public applause. They know that the greatest victories happen long before anyone notices them. Winning against doubt, refusing to become bitter after betrayal, choosing hope after disappointment, and holding on to your values when nobody would have blamed you for letting them go. Those are victories that rarely receive attention, yet they shape a person's entire character. The conversation slowly became less about your visible achievements and more about your unseen endurance. They realized that your greatest strength wasn't your ability to impress people. It was your ability to survive seasons that could have changed your heart for the worse, but didn't. That kind of strength cannot be measured by titles, wealth, or popularity. Number 11. They realized people were beginning to trust your reputation more than the rumours. The conversation took another unexpected turn when one person noticed something that had been quietly happening for a long time. The stories people once believed about you were no longer having the same effect. They weren't spreading the way they used to. In fact, whenever your name came up, more people were responding with, "That doesn't sound like them." Those simple words revealed that something had changed, and it wasn't the rumors. It was your reputation. A rumor can travel quickly because it feeds on emotion. It creates curiosity, stirs opinions, and gives people something to talk about. But a reputation is built differently. It grows through repeated actions, honest decisions, and consistent character. It isn't created in a single day, and it isn't easily destroyed by a single accusation. That's what they finally began to understand. One person admitted, "People believe what they've experienced with them more than what they've heard about them." That statement carried more weight than anyone expected. People who had worked with you, spoken with you, or watched you over time had formed their own conclusions. They didn't need someone else to tell them who you were because they had already seen it for themselves. Every honest conversation, every kept promise, every moment you chose integrity over convenience became another brick in the foundation of your reputation. Quietly, without making announcements, you were building something stronger than gossip could tear down. The conversation became uncomfortable because they realized rumors have one major weakness. They need constant feeding. If new evidence doesn't support them, they slowly lose their power. Eventually, people begin asking questions instead of accepting accusations. They start comparing the stories they've heard with the person they've actually come to know. When those two things don't match, the rumors begin collapsing under their own weight. One of them even confessed that they had once believed things about you simply because everyone else did. Now they felt embarrassed because reality had proven otherwise. Time had exposed the difference between loud opinions and quiet truth. Number 12. One of them asked the question. Nobody wanted to answer. Why does the truth keep catching up to them? The conversation reached its most uncomfortable moment when one person asked a question that nobody could easily dismiss. Have you noticed that the truth always seems to catch up to them? No one answered right away because they had noticed it too. It wasn't that everything in your life had been easy or perfect. It was that sooner or later, the real story always seemed to rise to the surface, no matter how deeply it had been buried. They started remembering situations where people had confidently judged you before knowing the facts. At the time, those opinions spread quickly because they sounded believable. But as the months and years passed, details began to emerge that didn't fit the original story. Pieces that had been ignored suddenly became impossible to overlook. The more complete the picture became, the harder it was to keep believing the old version of events. One person quietly admitted, "It's strange how the facts eventually seem to defend them." That observation changed the entire discussion. The truth has a quality that falsehood can never imitate. It remains consistent. A lie often needs new explanations to keep itself alive. It has to be protected, adjusted, and defended whenever fresh questions appear. The truth doesn't have that burden. It stays the same, even while opinions change around it. That's why time often becomes its greatest ally. As they reflected on everything that had happened, they realized that many of the people who spoke against you had eventually contradicted themselves. Some changed their stories. Others quietly stopped talking about the subject altogether. A few even behaved as though they had never said anything in the first place. They weren't correcting the record because they suddenly became brave. They were simply running out of ways to defend something that reality kept disproving. The conversation also exposed another uncomfortable truth. Many people confuse being first with being right. The first version of a story often receives the most attention, but attention is not the same as accuracy. The loudest voice in the beginning isn't always the most truthful one in the end. Number 13. They admitted your biggest victory happened long before anyone could see it. The conversation became surprisingly reflective when one person said something that changed the way they looked at your entire journey. I don't think their greatest victory is what we're seeing now. I think it happened years ago. That statement caught everyone off guard because most people only recognize success when it becomes visible. They notice the promotion, the confidence, the opportunities, or the respect. Very few stop to consider what had to happen inside a person before any of those things could ever appear on the outside. As they looked back, they realized there had been a season when you quietly changed in ways that most people completely missed. You stopped chasing approval from people who had already decided not to understand you. You stopped measuring your worth by who accepted you and who rejected you. You stopped carrying the impossible burden of making everyone happy. Those changes didn't make headlines. Nobody applauded them. Yet they became the turning point of your entire story. One person quietly admitted, everything changed when they stopped trying to prove themselves. That simple observation explained more than they expected. The need to constantly prove yourself can quietly drain your energy. It keeps you trapped in endless comparisons and unnecessary battles. Every criticism feels like an emergency. Every opinion feels like a verdict. But once you break free from that cycle, something remarkable happens. Your focus shifts from managing people's perceptions to building a life that reflects your values. That kind of freedom cannot be given by others because it begins with a decision made within. The conversation continued as they recognized another truth. Your visible progress wasn't the beginning of your transformation. It was the result of it. Long before people noticed your growth, you had already won the hardest battle. You had learned to guard your peace instead of defending your image. You had chosen purpose over popularity and consistency over applause. That was the victory they had overlooked. Number 14. The conversation ended with a truth neither of them expected to say out loud. By the end of the conversation, neither of them was speaking with the same confidence they had at the beginning. The discussion had started with opinions, assumptions, and old beliefs. But after looking at everything that had happened over the years, those beliefs no longer held together. The evidence kept pointing them in a different direction, and they could no longer ignore it. One person finally broke the silence and said, "Maybe we've been looking at their story the wrong way this whole time." Those words carried more weight than anyone realized. For so long, they thought your life was about proving your critics wrong. They assumed every step you took was an attempt to answer those who doubted you. But as they reflected on your journey, they saw something completely different. You weren't building your life around your critics. You were building it around your convictions. There is a huge difference. One path keeps you trapped in other people's opinions. The other sets you free to become who you were always meant to be. That realization forced them to confront something uncomfortable about themselves. They had spent so much time evaluating your choices that they had never stopped to examine their own. It is much easier to analyze someone else's life than to ask difficult questions about your own. Your journey quietly exposed that habit. One of them admitted, "We kept waiting for them to fail because it would have made our judgment feel justified." The room fell quiet again. That confession revealed the real reason behind many of their conversations. It had never been about discovering the truth. It had been about protecting the story they had already chosen to believe. But reality refused to cooperate. Every year that passed made it harder to hold on to old assumptions. Your consistency slowly dismantled conclusions that had once seemed certain. In that moment, they understood something that many people never do. A person's life cannot be accurately measured by rumors, first impressions, or temporary setbacks. Character reveals itself over time. Consistency tells a story that words cannot erase. The truth doesn't rush, but it keeps moving forward until it becomes impossible to ignore. The conversation ended with more than a changed opinion about you. It ended with a changed understanding of how easily people can misjudge someone when they rely on appearances instead of patience. They realized your greatest victory was never convincing everyone that you were right. It was staying true to who you were long enough for the truth to speak on your behalf. And in the end, that voice proved far more powerful than anything you could have said yourself. In the end, what this entire story reveals is not about secret conversations at all, but about how slowly truth reshapes what people believe. What begins as gossip, assumptions, and confident opinions eventually gets tested by time, experience, and reality itself. And when that happens, most of what was said behind your back doesn't survive the pressure of real facts. It gets replaced by something more uncomfortable for people to admit: understanding. Every point in this message leads to the same core realization. People talk, people judge, people assume, but life keeps moving, and as it does, it exposes what was real and what was imagined. The version of you they discussed in private conversations was never fully accurate because it was built on incomplete information, emotional reactions, and borrowed opinions. Meanwhile, your actual journey was being written in silence through discipline, restraint, growth, and decisions nobody was clapping for at the time. That is why these conversations always end the same way, not with loud apologies or dramatic admissions, but with quiet recognition. The realization that you were not as easy to define as they thought. The understanding that their certainty was often louder than their accuracy. And the uncomfortable awareness that time did not confirm their assumptions, it corrected them. What remains after all of this is a simple truth. Character always speaks louder than commentary. Rumours fade, but consistency builds something that even distance cannot erase. People may misunderstand you in the moment, but they cannot outtalk a life that keeps proving itself over time. That is the part they eventually had to face in silence. So while you were never present in that secret conversation, your actions were, your growth was, your restraint was, and in the end, that became louder than anything they could say about you. If this message spoke to you in any way, take a moment to please click the link in description box or the link in the comment section to support us on Ko-Fi with a tip so we can create more videos like this. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. It helps keep this message going and brings more powerful insights like this to others who need clarity, strength, and perspective in their own journey. God bless you.